Well, hello and welcome to the Soft UK podcast. I'm Kate Hart, the Communications Officer for the charity called Soft, which is a support organisation for families affected by trisomy 13 and 18. Today's podcast is a discussion with Sarah Dowdall, who's Emilia's mum, and we'll be talking about Mother's Day when you're actually living with trisomy. So, welcome, Sarah. Thank you. So, first of all, perhaps we can start off by you telling us a bit about your family and who lives with you, please.
Yeah, so my family, I am married. I have a husband called Sean. I have a 5.5-year-old little boy, and I have Emilia, who's almost 3 years old.
Fantastic. So, could you tell us a bit about Emilia's pregnancy? Because obviously she's the one we really want to talk about today.
Yeah, it was quite a difficult pregnancy for a number of reasons. So for the first couple of months things seemed fine. But then I had threatened miscarriage, and I'd end up having to have checks because I had quite a big subchorionic hematoma. So I bled lots of blood. I was back and forth from the early pregnancy assessment unit, and they said things all looked okay. We had then a 12-week scan, and things seemed all okay. And then I had blood work come back flagging some abnormalities in terms of hormone levels, and was contacted and told that this was indicative that Emilia would have either trisomy 18 or trisomy 13, Edwards or Pato's. So basically from there, it was recommended quite strongly that I have further testing just to see what was behind that, and that I thought about making some serious decisions. So one of the early discussions I had following the higher risk screening was how would I feel about having a pregnancy that was incompatible with life. And I remember that just really hitting me as quite a shock, really. I was literally just outside my office at work, and I took the call. I'd gone in, I just felt really numb and I wasn't quite sure what to think about it. But we opted for further testing. The CBS initial result was indicative of trisomy 18. And then the long-term culture was suggestive of mosaicism. But we were then going back and forth having further ultrasounds and further checks, which were all saying Emilia looked fine. So it was really confusing. And so we were trying to then have the amniocentesis because we were having this really puzzling picture, which basically went on for a couple of months of testing overall.
Sure.
Just that we were having this baby that on the ultrasound all looked healthy, but then these very serious discussions with consultants of fetal medicine saying this isn't good, this is looking like your baby's going to be very sick. And then various departments, because of being cross boundary with different health services, around whether I'd consider the termination process, and lots of confusion really. So emotions are really, really heightened. And I remember just spending most of those couple of months whilst the tests were ongoing, especially just crying and being very up and down, not knowing quite what it is that I wanted, and just saying I felt it was really unrealistic in relation to anticipatory grief, that I needed to grieve that this would be a normal pregnancy, a healthy baby, and trying to detach, but also realizing that just wasn't possible for me anyway.
Yeah, sure. Sounds like a roller coaster ride in the beginning there for you. And I mean, it's always uncertain, this journey, but even more uncertain because you were getting almost conflicting information from the scans versus the testing.
Mm.
So, how did you cope with that uncertainty, and what was the thing that worried you most at that time?
I just became really obsessive about researching everything, because that's what I do. I intellectualize. I have to research, know everything on a topic if I'm facing a situation. How I coped, I don't really know if coping is the right word, because I was incredibly stressed for the whole of the pregnancy, really. It felt, like you say, very conflicting. On the one hand, getting this information this pregnancy wasn't going to be viable, but then on the other hand, having an instinct and a feeling that things weren't as straightforward as what was initially being suggested to me. And I was sort of torn, because I was a bit like, am I crazy and in denial? Because I just wanted to see that this baby seemed okay in the scans. I was reading various research and contacting random people who I've had similar experiences, to try to make sense of the situation. But I think in reality, it was just realizing my whole beliefs around pregnancy and termination and what I thought I would do would be very different, because initially I had in my head the idea of continuing with a pregnancy that wasn't viable would just be the worst thing. And then I just kind of thought towards the end, I'm not sure it necessarily would have changed my decision making, whereas I had in I guess before I was in that situation, this very sort of black and white view that if things weren't right, that I would terminate. But the main thing that was in my head throughout, the question that I kept putting forward to the experts in fetal medicine and so forth, was I didn't want my baby to suffer. So my thoughts were that, that what I leaned towards is, if there is a sign that baby was going to suffer more in the pregnancy, that would be the only time that I would then consider the termination. I think that's where my mind went, is I just didn't want my baby to suffer. And very much that being my priority one way or another. It's like I just kind of thought, if it was a case of I had to make a difficult decision to minimize my child suffering, that's what I would need to do. And yeah, that I think is what I kept my focus on.
Yeah, okay. And Sarah, when was it that you first got in touch with SOFT, or first found out about SOFT? Where did that come in your journey?
When I was searching things obsessively over the internet, and I came across Soft UK, and I read all of the stories, like the family stories on the website. I then found some people on Facebook and basically Facebook stalked them. Not actual stalking, I hope, but just sort of messaging and reaching out and trying to make connections and talk to people who'd had experiences. And then when I got the Mosaic results, in particular, searching out people who'd had experiences of mosaicism, so I reached out to some of the mothers in the sub community who had Mosaic children. And I also found like pages and things around Mosaic trisomy.
Okay, thank you. And if we sort of come into the present day, can you tell us about Emilia and how she is and what her prognosis looks like?
Yeah, it's very tricky with Emilia, because it was one of these things where it was a bit surreal, because going up to her birth, I almost felt like it was like there was potentially a bit of a doomsday thing, that would be this revelation like at the birth that something was going to be really wrong, because I seem to get such mixed responses. So the fetal medicine department, once the Mosaic culture came back as it was, and then when we had the third trimester scan and there were no anomalies found, and she'd scanned us for about 2 hours, so, and she was very, very thorough. She was like, right, well, the prognosis now is going to be good. She said, from what I can see from the evidence, the prognosis is likely to be good. So there could still be some unknowns in the future, but in terms of healthy baby, what I'm seeing is I'm not seeing this as being something that there's something fundamentally wrong with baby. She said that it was a case of monitoring the placental function, because the placenta had a lot of trisomy in it, and that's obviously where the CBS culture came back as high in the percentages, and then she came off as full trisomy in the rapid culture. It was like I had that in my head, and it was like I was researching it and I was thinking, oh, that sounds quite good then. Then I'd found cases online with mosaicism where they were healthy children. But then on the other hand, I remember I went in for a scan when there was reduced fetal movements, and I was really anxious. I'd gone into hospital, and although my first pregnancy I went in, there was very much oh yeah, he's doing great, blah blah blah. With this, when I was going in, it was almost like how the midwife spoke to me when I had that check was like she expected there to be something really wrong from the test results and everything. And she was just it was almost like, oh well, so what if baby's not moving? And that's a bit how it felt to me, like it didn't matter. And it got me questioning things, and then at height of my anxiety, more like they're expecting things to go wrong. And throughout the delivery, there's all this, we need this team on site and that team on site. So like I had to time my induction around which having all these specialist teams because they're expecting something to go really wrong at the birth. So in the lead up to the birth, it was almost like it felt strange in terms of the prognosis, because then she was born and these people, like the midwives around, were like, oh, she actually looks normal, kind of thing, and like there's nothing wrong. And I was just a bit like, okay, this is a bit weird. And all these teams and moved over to their like devices and technology on, because I think we had like a whole circus outside the suite basically. And it's just like, it's been a bit like that since, is that we haven't had further testing, because when you mention trisomy 18, there's always a response of, you still read it in lots of articles, this isn't compatible with life, this is a terminal diagnosis. And I just feel like there's, the moment you mention it, there's this whole horror and professionals back away. And I almost feel like having that further testing with Emilia could draw attention to things, and maybe she wouldn't get equitable healthcare because of that being on her medical records. So I sort of live with some of that worry, because on the outside she looks perfect, really. She's very happy, she's very playful. There's odd things that happen where I then question her health and her development. So at the moment she's not as forward with her language as her brother has always been. She's gone through a period of just sort of regressing with her language at times, and I'm there thinking, is this something developmental that's related to trisomy? And there's an anxiety and a worry in my mind of that is something that could come up and it could develop. But it's not something that is really fully registering. It's like you can't ever really know with mosaic trisomy what the impact's going to be, or whether something's going to come up in years ahead, or how much might be coincidence that she might be a baby without trisomy that could still have certain things happen that could prop up, and you just don't know. You don't know how much could be trisomy, how much could just be that she's a character in her own right, or might have something else going on. But yeah, she's an absolute pleasure. Apart from anything else, she's very independent, very stubborn. So her praise at the moment is very much, whenever I say anything to her, she'll say things like, I said no about anything, whenever you're trying to like her dress for bed or anything. And then she'll try wagging her finger at me saying, I want this. And I'll be joking, but going, you're not the boss of me. And she's like going, yes, I am, mummy. Yes, I am. So it's quite funny. And she's very boisterous, very playful, very physical. So yeah, she's lovely.
Oh, she sounds amazing. And the tricky thing is that despite her being presenting as healthy and quote unquote normal, you still have that, you're still living with that uncertainty, just reading between the lines. So I mean, that sounds really, really tricky. I suppose, have you found any ways to cope, or is it just you manage it on a day-to-day basis?
I just try to go back to what I've said since, I think that what I said when I was about 20 something weeks pregnant, and we're having the scans that come back as they were, and I turned around to my husband and said, I'm not going to terminate at this point. I won't, because she seems so healthy, she seems normal. And I said, the thing is that we could have a baby in any circumstances, that there's nothing that crops up in the pregnancy, nothing in terms of checks or tests to indicate anything's wrong, and things could always go wrong. And in life, there aren't any certainties. So I just try to think back to that and think she's an individual and she's a child in her own right, and that things can happen, and we will never really know what the future holds regardless. You won't get a certainty of any pregnancy or any baby, and you just have to go with the flow. You have to recognize everyone's individual, and there'll be no doubt any number of conditions that we in the medical community and society are not at all aware of. We don't know why so many illnesses happen. There's so more that we don't know than what we do know in terms of health.
So true. And like you say, that could be a worry and a concern for any parent of any child. No, excuse me, no one's got any guarantee of what the future holds or what it's going to look like. So I suppose it's just making peace with that.
Yeah.
And then coming on to Mother's Day, I mean, does a day like Mother's Day feel any different to you? I mean, Emilia is your second child. Has it been more difficult, or just talk us through that, please?
I think I feel more grateful for Emilia of everything that we've been through. Not that I wouldn't say I was ever not grateful as a
Yeah.
mum. I've always been
Yeah.
very grateful to have my oldest child, Logan, and my, how lovely he is, and he's a blessing to my life. But I think you're aware of how precarious life is, and that nothing is a given, in a way that I can't look at any pregnancy the same anymore. Like each time someone it's like, oh man, Des, I've just had my 12-week scan, and they're talking about things, and then they're talking about the scan to find out the sex. I'm just very much like, oh yeah, I just can't feel the same way about those milestones, because I'm there thinking I was 12 weeks and everything was apparently fine, and lots of time that can happen with trisomy, and that things can just go wrong. And I go back to where I was at, where like I'd had the scan and then all these tests were happening for months afterwards. I can't just see like the gender scan as a gender scan, because I see it as an anomaly scan, and it's very specifically timed for detecting anomalies and checking that the pregnancy is healthy. And so when people talk about that, like I've got a couple of colleagues around me who talk about their Mother's Day and they're pregnant this year, and I'm just very much like they're all having like their 20-week scans the next few weeks, and they're just like, yeah, I wonder if I find out the gender. And I'm almost thinking like, I don't want to say anything because I don't want to take that away from them, that that there can still be all that uncertainty. And so yeah, I think there is a difference in that respect.
Yeah, it's made you look at the whole thing quite differently, but it's lovely that gratitude is one of the outcomes of all of this.
Yeah.
So, and I have to ask, what have you got planned for Mother's Day this year, Sarah?
Haven't actually got anything planned, because the way I see it, it's about the company you have. So the only thing that I plan to do is have the day with my babies, having lots of cuddles with them, and then that day is perfect.
Oh, lovely. That's beautiful. And just finally to end off, what advice would you give to anyone listening today, having heard your story and how unique it is? Do you have any message for people?
I think to have confidence in yourself and your decision making. Every journey is different, because I remember going through the process and just thinking I probably just sound absolutely crazy, delusional. And I remember just one time going and see the consultant when we first had the CVS culture say trisomy 18, and the consultant looking at me, and I could just see the look in her eyes of, oh, this dear crazy girl, let me draw you a diagram. And I'm glad that I did stick to my guns, but I was there thinking, yeah, she clearly just thinks I'm deranged and in complete denial. And I think there's something about whatever decision you make has to be right for you and sit well with you, and no one can tell you exactly what that's going to be. And sometimes that can feel overwhelming in itself, but it's important whatever decision you make feels right for you, and it's your baby. I guess if you're a mother, it's your body. And yeah, I don't know if that really makes sense, but I just think also the sense of it you're not being alone. I think there's certain things that I've noticed more, and maybe it's just because I'm tuned in. But I think since the accessibility of things like the NIP test and various other things, there's more people who are going through processes of having a lot of red flags brought up that wouldn't otherwise have come to medical eyes or attention. And before a lot of these things came up, then what we'd see is that people just have standard pregnancies. They wouldn't have like the screenings, or then whether that's the hormone level ones, or whether it's a NIP test, and it would just be like what they see on the scan. And in the case of, I think with Emilia, if I'd had her 20 years ago, before all of these things became more than 20 years ago, because in the 90s, a lot of this stuff was still available, then I probably wouldn't have been any the wiser. And I almost think the naivety around that and the not having that knowledge would have made the pregnancy more enjoyable for me. And I almost wonder sometimes what life would be like if I say had Emilia in the 80s or whatever. Obviously I would have been alive probably, but like, it would in actual fact, like if I time traveled and I lived through that era, and I was having her 40 years earlier or whatever, what would my experience have been like? Would I've just had a pregnancy, had a bit of bleeding, and then been like, oh, I've got a healthy baby, and not known any of these. And I think that's a responsibility with the technology that we have that's advancing, is it's exciting science, it's exciting technology, but it is limited. And I think there's great strength in, as a parent, saying to doctors, we don't have all the answers, and being confident saying that can be quite difficult, because you're there thinking all these people around me are experts, but they're not you. They're not in your situation, not living your life, and your instinct as a mother to your baby, that is important.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so I think, just to sum up what you've said there, it's about making the right decision for you, because you're the one who has to live with whatever that decision is, not being influenced by outside parties, and then also just having the strength and the courage to ask the right questions and stand by your convictions. So
yeah.
Fantastic, Sarah. Thank you. Well, I really hope that this conversation has given some insight into what a journey with mosaicism looks like, and how that makes a big day like Mother's Day feel, to someone who's walked that path. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story, Sarah. And thanks to everyone for listening. And just to say that whether you're an expectant parent or a bereaved parent, a family member, or a professional, if you need support or information, we are here for you. So please reach out to Soft, and our contact details can be found in the podcast blurb. Thanks again.